Hey there, viewers. This is Maritza Grooms, virtually coming to you to do history in Lowell with my virtual professor now. So sad to see you in a
Working
virtual
for
way.
Zoom University.
That is amazing. But we are in some, and as much as I hate hearing this word right now, unprecedented times. And as terrible as everything is, it is, from a historical perspective, kind of exciting to have a front row seat to everything that's going on, and to be able to look back like we tend to do and see the correlations and
So you're
patterns.
doing a show 50 years from now, you can say, when I was a kid.
Yeah. So let's go backwards. Let's go where we feel most comfortable, maybe. Let's go back into time. How far back do we want to go? Maybe about 100 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could actually go a little bit further. I was thinking about this more this morning as I knew we were going to chat. And so the country, if we think about the country in turmoil and nobody quite knowing what it's going to look like coming out the other side, right? I mean, because I think that's the question we want to talk about now, and what do we do about it? I mean, there are three different periods, I think. One is the Civil War, and sort of, again, nobody quite knows what's going to happen, who might win. Is there going to be a southern something or other and a northern something or other? Is the country going to split apart? Depending on how the war ends, are enslaved people going to be freed or not? And nobody quite knows how to put the country, if you want to think of it as Humpty Dumpty, nobody quite knows how we're going to put it back together again. So that's one period, I think, that is somewhat similar. The second period is the global flu pandemic, 1917, 1918, which affects the entire world, but has an incredible impact here in the United States, but again, as well, Europe and other places in the world too. And the third time, I think, again, where people don't quite know what's it going to look like out the other side, is the Great Depression. Stock market crash, economic collapse. At the time, unprecedented unemployment rates, no social infrastructure to speak of to help people. And nobody's quite sure what's going to happen at the end of that. So those are the three periods to me that are most comparable, I think.
Definitely. And I think they all have elements of everything that's happening right now. And we see it across the board, on a global level, all of the things from each of those periods of time. So, all right, let's start wherever you would want to. Yeah. Well, I only did my homework for the flu and the Great Depression beyond.
Okay. Well, I mean, the Civil Wars, I threw you a curveball, I think. I mean, I thought about the Civil War again because we're a fairly new country at that particular moment, right? I mean, less than 70 years or so. And now we're at war with each other over a fundamental social, economic, political, human rights question. And again, there's no blueprint, right? And I think that's what's the same about all these different eras we were talking about. There's not a blueprint for, okay, how can we fix this? It's not like you can go to IKEA and get a thing to put a bed together, even though you go crazy trying to put it together, at least you have direction. There are no directions, right? And so, and I think, again, thinking about then and now, the differences are, if we think about this, so Lincoln's president for much of the Civil War and is involved in much of the thinking initially about, okay, what are we going to do on the other end? In the flu pandemic, in 1718, Woodrow Wilson is the president, former president of Princeton University, very smart guy. In the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, who most historians would think of as one of the top 2 or 3 presidents in the history of the country. And so in those three big crises, we actually have somebody who's smart and somebody
a competent human leading the country.
Yes. And so that's, again, a difference, right? That in those three deeply fracturing situations, there are people in leadership who know how to inspire some degree of confidence, who are smart, who are not anti-smart, who are not anti-science, who are not anti, like, let's make a plan and let's surround ourselves with smart people, because that's what Lincoln, Wilson, and Roosevelt do in their presidencies. And so in those three moments, there's a better collection of people trying to figure out what do we do than there is right now. I mean, outside of Dr. Fauci or Fauci or whatever his name is, like when I look on the news briefing, it's like, if I look at that and think, okay, FDR's cabinet and the people he surrounded himself, Lincoln's cabinet, the people he surrounded himself with, Donald Trump, no, distant third, distant third.
Exactly. And you look at those times, it really seemed like the welfare of humans was at the forefront, and people were trying to figure out, how do we help our people? How do we secure, our people for this? Right now, it doesn't seem like humans are at the forefront. It seems like there were a lot of other interests going on.
It seems somewhat missing in the arguing over where the supplies are going to come from, and should the states all bid against each other, and all this falderall that I'm hearing. It's just, and again, what was fascinating to me earlier in the week when President Trump claimed he was a wartime president, right? I mean, that's what Roosevelt did in the 30s. He acted as though we were at war. But he actually did stuff. He didn't just say it. He didn't posture it. And so by the late 1930s, when we're inching closer to being in the Second World War, and when the Great Depression is still, the conditions are still pretty much alive in the country, he does go to the big corporations and say, we need to transform what you're doing and get ourselves on a better footing, because war is inevitable. And right now we don't have the stuff we need to win a war. And he does it. And the corporations respond, and they do it. And the public responds, and they do it as well. And they make sacrifice and whatever. And again, I think we've not seen that same sort of generosity of spirit at the top, which then inspires other people to do the same. And that's where we end up with people doing weird things like hoarding bottled water and toilet paper.
And
right?
sanitizer.
It's crazy, right? That that these things happen. And so Roosevelt was very different in the way he dealt with things. It's interesting looking at the flu pandemic in the aftermath of World War I. We did do social, we did do physical, I don't want to call it social distancing anymore. I want to call it physical distancing. We did do physical distancing. And so, what was really incredible, if you think about it, right? People, lots of soldiers from Greater Lowell, from Greater Boston, Cambridge, whatever, Somerville, who had enlisted in the First World War, who fought and came back, when they got to Boston Harbor on troop ships, they were immediately put on sealed trains and brought to Fort Devens out along Route 2 in Massachusetts, and kept separated for I don't remember exactly how many days it was, but essentially it was a forced quarantine to see whether you came down with the symptoms, and then you would stay longer or you would be let out. And so your family, who hadn't seen you for 2 years or 1.5 years or whatever it was from the war, now would have to wait longer. Oh. But it took a while for people to realize one of the preventatives was separate people potentially who might be ill, but we didn't have the testing. And then, well, although I'm not sure we have testing now either, it seems like that's remained a myth. But so Fort Devens became the sort of hospital grounds, and in Lawrence, at where Lawrence General Hospital is, they built literally a tent city, and separated people that way from the main population that would be going inside Lawrence Hospital. They would basically stay in these tent areas again until it was seen whether or not they were symptomatic. But I mean, what what I don't understand, and I'm not obviously I'm not a scientist. I fail to understand 100 and somewhat, roughly 100 years later, how the science hasn't advanced further along, because I feel like we're scrambling the same way now that they were scrambling back then. The only substantive difference is, there's better communication, but the actual
Right.
response to it and getting it under control doesn't feel that much different than what I've read when I've read books
Not
about
at
that
all.
flu pandemic in the early 20th century.
It doesn't feel different at all. Just knowing that they also ran out of the protective gear, knowing that people had to start making it from home, knowing that even after they were in recovery, folks still weren't practicing physical distancing, and that led to smaller outbreaks for another 2 years
Mhm.
after.
Yeah.
So like it just feels like, yeah, this doesn't feel really great right now. It feels
No,
like
and
we're in a
that's what
crisis.
that's what's surprising, right? I mean, I forget. I'm not going to remember the cities, but there were two cities in the sort of when victory was proclaimed and the war was over. I think it was. I don't want to get a city historically incorrect. So anyway, there were two large cities. One city banned any sort of a crowd, big
Mhm.
rejoicing celebration for the end of the war because of what was happening health-wise. Another city decided not to. And then when historians have gone back and looked at the mortality rates in both of these places, no big surprise, the city that had the huge gathering in the square, if you will, like a Times Square's kind of a thing, those folks had much more catastrophic, more people caught it and more people died as a consequence of catching it. And so again, it's sort
Mhm.
of 4 months ago in December, January, when this started coming along, people could have read a history book and said, okay, well, look at the
Mhm.
stupid things people did in 1918. Let's not do that same stupid thing now. Let's ban crowding now. Let's not wait till
Exactly.
March.
And that's
Uh,
what I've seen too. The earlier and more aggressive the
yeah.
prevention was, the better folks did, the better the economy recuperated afterwards,
Mhm.
all of those things.
Yeah.
So, it's not a bandwagon to stay home. This,
No,
stay
no,
home,
no. And
people.
again, the history for it to read a history. I mean, I don't think the president reads, but if anybody around him read a history book, they could have seen this. It's very, very clear when people went back later and wrote histories, sort of, and that's one of the more stunning. I should have paid attention to remember the cities more, but that's really a stunning kind of an example of. And I mean, the other thing that is the thing that's more troubling now, right, compared to say the 30s and the Great Depression or whatever. In the Great Depression, when the stock market crashed and then the banks failed and unemployment skyrocketed to the levels it's probably going to be in the U.S. in the next couple of weeks, it's going to be pushing. I mean, unemployment in Lowell, Massachusetts, in 1932 was 40%,
Mm, mm,
right? So, and there was no social safety net of any kind. Relief would come from churches or social groups, but the numbers of people unemployed um, just overwhelmed any sort of private relief. And the challenge that Roosevelt faced was, well, then what do we do, right?
right.
How do we stabilize things? But what was different is people could be together. And I find
Yeah.
this profoundly different in the sense of there was something about in Lowell in the 30s, people being able to organize face to face, workers trying
Mhm.
to organize, community groups trying to organize. There were rent strikes that people organized so people wouldn't be tossed out of their homes. If people were going to be evicted for non-payment of rent, their friends would show up and prevent people from evicting them. It was, and not just in Lowell, but all over the country. And that, I mean, that's what's missing now, right? It's sort of like
Mhm.
people are trying to do, important things in virtual reality or whatever, are kind of like what we're doing now, because It's the only thing we have, but it's different. And that's
Yeah.
really troubling to me in the sense of thinking about, so how do we get the economy going again? Right? Because in the 30s, when finally Roosevelt grasped the notion that massive infusions of public money had to get into the economy, he basically created these programs to build buildings, to build roads, to build bridges, to build schools. And people could then get together and do those things and be paid and spend their money. And that's what stabilized. It didn't change everything. It didn't, in 4 or 5 years, it didn't make everything great again, but it leveled things off, and it allowed people to participate and feel like they were doing something. And that's missing now. It's really hard. And so, I can give money to the Lowell Food Bank, which I've done, but it's not the same thing as me being able to go there and help distribute food, which in the 1930s, hopefully I would have been aware enough that I would have been at a food bank doing that, right? I would have thought, okay, yeah, I'm fine, I'll go. But now we can't. And I keep being told I'm old and I should go nowhere. So that's freaking the hell out of me too.
I know. No, you can't go anywhere, Bob. You have to stay put.
I'm homebound.
We treasure you far too much to lose you sooner than is necessary. But it is, and one thing I really love about Lowell is that sense of community, even though I'm all the way out here in virtual land. But I had someone, actually a young person, who was displaced, and not due to the crisis, but due to really just terrible parenting. But during this crisis, and that kid is in Lowell. What was I supposed to do? So I immediately tapped into a couple of groups on Facebook, and almost, I want to say within minutes, someone was able to get resources. This kid has a job now. She has a place to stay. Lowell really is that place that, I always feel the community feel. But outside of those things, it's not like we can all go to where she is and help her move and, give her a hug afterwards and say, hey, we care about you,
And I was thinking about this too, so I've been in touch with my students a lot over the last 3 or 4 weeks since everybody had to abandon campus. And I was talking to some of them about how they felt. And some of them, when they talked, they were actually describing being in mourning in a way, because they had been wrenched out of their community, right? They went on spring break, and while they were on the 3rd day of spring break, they were told, don't come back.
Right.
Because we're going to do this for a couple of weeks, and then within another week it was, you're not coming back at all. Make a time individually to come get your stuff and get out of the dorm. Now, for people who couldn't, they didn't throw people out on the street. I don't want to mislead anybody who's watching, but all of a sudden, this whole support network that people had, what you were talking about a second ago with the young person that that cluster, that network just dissipated. And everybody ended up almost overnight being in a living situation that they never thought they would be in, or maybe they thought they would be in the middle of May. And lots of students who were seniors or looking forward to graduation and the ceremony and all of that, that's pulled out from under them. And then somehow we're supposed to carry on delivering education as though whatever. And most people are sensitive enough to figure out, no, it's not normal. But after 9/11, as the example I was talking about with my students, people could hug each other, your point from earlier, and console each other. How you doing, right? And do it not this way. This is the best we can do. I've had online drinking parties where
same here.
People swimming and drinking beer and talking, but still, it's better than nothing. I'm glad I'm seeing you and we're chatting, and I'll feel good for a while afterwards that we did it. But it's still not the same as when we were in that studio on Market Street. So hopefully that happens again.
Exactly. I know. I keep thinking, like you said, to your point in the beginning, how do we stabilize after this? Is there going to be stability? How soon? And we definitely can't go back to the same way that things were before. And those three major events that we, listed, we talked about it. There were times where everything had to change.
Yep.
There was so much that needed to change, and we had the leadership that understood that, and we had the leadership that also, I think, assuaged fears and kind of made us feel like, okay, maybe we're going through hard times, but this leadership makes me feel inspired that we're going to get there, we're going to get to that stability. This current leadership does not make me feel that kind of hope.
Yeah,
I don't
I mean,
feel that.
I think you're right, and I think people refer to this now as, people use fancy words, and so people are calling this an inflection point. Like, this is the same way that with the collapse of civil society institutions, the inability of the private sector to deal with the consequences of the stock market crash and bank failures, people had to completely rethink the role of the state. And out of that, we got things like minimum wage, Social Security, some degree of health insurance coverage for some number of people, and we made these sorts of changes, which nobody in 1925 could have ever imagined. By 1940, we would have those sorts of things, right? And so, right, you can assume. I mean, I think your point is the correct one, that all sort of old ways of thinking are now going to be up for grabs, and people are going to have to really rethink questions of who gets health insurance, and how much is too much private in healthcare delivery. How much did we go too far into the realm of private profit making into the delivery of healthcare and in the development of medicines? How much did we fail the sort of public mission, the commons, so-called, right? All in New England, all old towns had a common, right? And the common was like to graze your sheep or your cattle. Nobody could afford a big yard, and nobody had a big yard. People had the commons. People shared the commons, and that's where this term came from historically. And so, like Boston Common, right? During the First World War and then during the Second World War, Boston Common was plowed up for gardens to grow food. The Fenway area around Fenway Park, and that's still gardens now growing food and vegetables. But all over the country, people were asked to do that kind of work and have victory gardens, right? To grow food and to grow food collectively. And again, now that's such a collaborative, interesting process to be able to engage in, but we can't, sort of like it's the model, again, your Lowell examples, it's Mill City grows, but we can't do Mill City grows, right? When spring comes and across from me in Centerville, where there's now a plot, that I may have had, we can't yet go do that because we can't we have to physically distance, right? And yet that process of growing stuff and talking to each other would be a huge way toward healing. Again, sort of on the other side. The economy, I'm usually pessimistic anyway, but this is going to be really hard to try to figure out how you restart, and the conversation about too much money going to big businesses and not enough money going to, like the small places in Lowell, the barbershops in Lowell, the various ethnic immigrant food places that everybody around here loves, small markets and little stores along the way, all of that, right? It's going to be really hard to try to figure that out. And without some smarter people at the top of the ship thinking these things through, I'm not overly optimistic that people are going to do the right thing. And again, it's hard to, I envision, for example, in September, like there's starting to be these rumblings of, well, maybe we need to call the presidential election off.
Of
It's too
course.
dangerous
And
to go vote.
I'm not surprised by that because this guy's like definitely gunning to be a dictator. But I have seen some movement to make voting by mailing a thing.
Yeah. And people are talking about
Which,
that, right? I mean, people are saying, well,
yeah,
we have to figure out another way to do it. We have to do secure online, but there's no way that we can not have an election in November. But I mean, the Democratic Party, I believe, already pushed back their convention from earlier
yeah,
this summer to, I think, August, which gets much closer to sort of traditionally the presidential campaign kicks off after Labor Day. But there's no indication either that what we're going through now, it could abate a bit in the summer and the early fall, but there's no reason to believe it wouldn't come back again
exactly.
in October.
Hmm.
On that cheery note.
I know there are so many things, and I have this quote even from one of the articles that you assigned me wonderfully. I have this here. The number of deep uncertainty, a sense of proceeding without a map, remained relentless and enveloping. A climate of universal fear deeply affected political understandings and concerns. Nothing was sure. And then a while later, only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment. And that was about the Great Depression.
That was about the Great Depression, right?
Right.
And in
But here we
reality,
are.
I mean, the scary thing about all that is, in reality, with all the work that the government did and all the money that got infused into the economy, what really got people back to work was the war.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so what Roosevelt was able to accomplish is stopping the hemorrhaging and sort of leveling off and getting more people money in their pocket to spend. But any real consequential dent in the unemployment rate, for example, really didn't occur until late 1940, 1941, when war production started. And then once Pearl Harbor and we declared war, and so many men registered for the draft and what have you, lots of women then entered the job market from the program we did before of Rosie the Riveter, when you had your Rosie the Riveter outfit on.
Yeah. Better times.
Yeah, but that's really what got people going again. And so when he talks about, when the current president talks about being a wartime president, there's actually not, I've not seen a manifestation of that in the same way you would have seen it in
No,
1940.
not even close. I think he's just battling the many voices in his mind that tell him that he said things and knew things before they happened. I'm very, very tired of the circus at this point.
I've stopped
But
watching.
yeah, exactly. There's no hope. There's no order. The only hope that I have right now are humans like you and places like LTC and the place that I work, Cambridge
Mm-hmm.
Community Television,
Yep.
that are trying to keep people connected and informed the best way that we can, and keep people entertained, right? Because we know that in this time, anything could happen, but community is where it's at. And
Bottom
even though
line.
we can't physically be together.
Yeah, we got to figure out a way to do it the way we're doing it this morning.
Exactly.
Yep.
And I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for Wendy.
And I for you, I for Wendy, for letting us do this. And hopefully we can do it every other week, maybe.
Awesome. Thank you all for tuning in. This is History on Lowell. And hopefully you're staying home and staying safe.
Stay safe, everybody.